All right. I think we had a pretty hard and fast starting time. So we'll let people trickle in, but we will slowly get going. Thank you everyone for being here or for joining this webinar. Firstly, wanting to acknowledge country. This project and our team at Jumbunna are coming from a number of different spaces. We've got Gadigal, Gweagal, Gunnegarra. We've got some up north as well as a part of our team and some down south. So acknowledging all countries that people are coming from today, and also acknowledging Ngunnawal in Canberra for this project. So thank you everyone for being here. We'd like to give a special mention and some other acknowledgements to the artists for our project. We had Erica Jade, Jaden, and Damon, who created the works for ACT Justice and facilitated by Sisters in Spirit, which was fantastic. And really to all the other First Nations people and and organisations that assisted with the fieldwork and the project as a whole. Our deepest thanks for that work. We are quite proud of the outcome and that uptick that we did have, and it was down to specific people and organisations who did run with us over very many approaches and meetings. In terms of our team, for those who may not have got across it or may not have read it at the moment, you'll be hearing today from the team at Jumbunna Law and Justice Hub, which we have Professor Chris Cunneen, head of criminology and the head of our Law and Justice Hub. We have Fiona Allison, we have Tatiana Corrales and James Bofis, and Aisha Selleck as well on that team. The link to the report should be in the chat by now as well. Yep, Aisha's just posted that up. So if people are needing to look through or to look over or to double check, please have a look in that chat as we get going. Really wanting to mention we are going to have a Q&A at the conclusion of this presentation, so from 1:45 to 1:55. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat as we go through. Attach a email or some sort of contact. If we're not able to address it throughout the presentation, we will get back to you for those questions, and we will try and address the majority at the end of this presentation. Okay, so please start, if you have them already saved up, start uploading them, please. All right, going to hand it over to Professor Cunneen to start the intro of the report.
Thanks, James. So we just scroll down through the slides, Aisha, to the consultation page. I just want to say in relation to the report in the introduction that we did undertake widespread consultation with First Nations organisations and with community. We had community dialogues. We met with people incarcerated in adult and juvenile prisons. We spoke to government agencies, and all the numbers are there in that slide in terms of who we talked to. Not only government agencies, but statutory authorities, legal services, and other non-Aboriginal community organisations that might have had some First Nations programs. And we are confident that everyone who actually genuinely wanted to speak to us was able to participate in this process. There were some people who declined to participate, both in the community and in government, which was their right to do. But overall, we had an excellent response. I also want to make a couple of quick comments that are in the introduction in terms of the elements of our approach. In the introduction, there's a discussion around gender, First Nations women, and their relationship to the criminal legal system. There's no separate section in the report as such, and we deal with First Nations women and gender issues as they arise across all the relevant sections of the report. Similarly, with disability, in the introduction, there's a discussion around the relationship between disability and the criminal legal system, which is an extraordinarily important relationship. We also acknowledge the prevalence of issues around disability within the First Nations community. And again, that is an issue that we discuss where it arises in relevant sections throughout the report. And finally, just as part of the intro, I wanted to mention that we have a discussion on overrepresentation, where we try to explain both the benefits and the limitations of this concept of overrepresentation. In particular, how you can have what's soon to be quite contradictory pictures, if you like, of First Nations incarceration, because we know that in the ACT, it has the highest rate of overrepresentation compared to non-Indigenous people in Australia. But we also know by national standards that the imprisonment rate of First Nations people in the ACT is relatively low compared to jurisdictions like the Northern Territory and WA in particular, where it's double the rate that it is in the ACT. So I think it's important to hold both those things together, that you can have high levels of overrepresentation, but at the same time have relatively low imprisonment rates. And in fact, the non-Indigenous imprisonment rate in the ACT is the lowest in Australia. So they were just some general comments about that's in the introduction, and we can move on to Fiona.
Yep, we'll slide over to Fiona. There's a few people that have jumped on since we started. Just noting we have had a pretty big question come up on the Q&A. Please keep uploading them. We do want to hear them, and we do want to be able to report back. And to those that are joining as well, those special mentions, a few people have jumped on. Thank you again for this project, and looking forward to the discussion. So Fiona.
Sure, thanks, James. Okay, so in terms of how we approach the review and report writing, we have had some focus on some core structural issues that need attention as drivers over representation if this is to be reduced. So obviously changes are required within the criminal legal system, and the second half of the report sets out recommendations in this particular area, with some focus on what JACS and CSD, with its responsibilities for youth justice, can do better. But we did hear too a lot about drivers of overrepresentation, that they were much more complex than this, and they require complex solutions that work more preventatively, and they may actually sit outside of the criminal legal system, so in areas like housing and health. The report has two standalone sections on two of these areas, education and child protection, which we'll hopefully touch on today. And we identify in the report how these areas link with overrepresentation and could help reduce it via implementation of a number of recommendations that we set out in the report. So we've suggested in the report that the same approach really needs to be applied across the whole of the ACT government. Overrepresentation at some level is seen as the cumulative result of decisions made across government, and to reduce it, a whole of government response is needed. It's not just about piling more responsibility on JACS or CSD. And as government tends to work in silos, there's really at the moment not enough work being done to bring a more coordinated response to the interaction of different issues and areas of government activity. Next slide, thanks, Aisha. So other core issues we cover include a lack of First Nations input into decision making, likely to impact overrepresentation, and problems we heard about include not being asked for input or input not sufficiently informing government decisions. We also heard a lot about limited accountability for government to be genuinely guided by community input, to implement recommendations of reports such as this, or to otherwise do better in terms of its approaches to overrepresentation. We do set out in a little bit of detail in the report existing commitments under Closing the Gap and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or ACT agreement, as really important starting points, at least, for guiding change and lifting accountability. And what we did here is there's not really any consequences as such at the moment for not implementing these and other commitments. So what these two frameworks also importantly identify is that, and something we heard in conversations too, we really need a dual focus to achieving change. So you'll see a number of recommendations in the report that ensure a greater role for First Nations people in tackling overrepresentation, but they also make really clear the recommendations that government is not absolved of its own responsibility to self-transform in areas like accountability and so on. Thanks, Aisha. Next slide. One of the ways we respond to these structural issues in the report is to look at government and First Nations justice and cross-issue mechanisms and what role they could play in improving decision-making, accountability and coordination in the area of overrepresentation. So there is a lot of detail in the report in section 2, but as examples, we heard that bodies like ATSI Urban Justice Caucus really don't go far enough at the moment in terms of ensuring the ACT has an independent First Nations-led body that sets a wholly community-defined agenda for change with sufficient oversight over justice-related issues. And mechanisms in government like the Executive Coordination Group also don't quite meet the mark. That is a cross-directorate mechanism for implementation of JAC's policy, and at the moment has some limitations in terms of its levels of coordination and First Nations community input. We thought that more thinking is required about how these bodies can work effectively as standalone mechanisms and collectively. Though what we did here really clearly is that there's definitely a need for greater First Nations leadership in this space. So for that reason and to ensure more accountability, we have recommended that a well-resourced and otherwise supported interim First Nations-led justice body be established, and that's to provide oversight over implementation of the review recommendations. We also recommended that this interim body then work with government by a First Nations-led process to identify ongoing mechanisms to strengthen self-determination and address these issues of accountability and coordination. And we have put some ideas forward for consideration, potentially a social justice commissioner role, an ACT justice policy partnership or something similar, and that the interim body could actually become something more permanent. The other thing we've recommended in this space is establishing 3 roles that again try to tackle these core structural issues. They need to be set up at a sufficiently senior level to ensure that First Nations input into decisions is happening in a meaningful way. That's definitely something that came through loud and clear. And they might do such things as focus on supporting the First Nations led justice body around implementation of the recommendations. Thanks, Aisha. Next slide. Section 3 of the report then considers reform in some other specific areas, but it does return to these core issues again. And one set of issues that we deal with is systemic racism and cultural safety. So these are identified as really significant drivers of overrepresentation. We heard accounts of racial profiling, inequity in sentencing outcomes and other issues within the criminal legal system. Outside of the system, issues that came up included criminal record discrimination, which might, for example, impact on accessing employment that then feeds into reincarceration, or systemic racism in education, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. And we heard that the ACT is taking some positive action in this space, but overall it needs to have a much greater investment across government to address these really significant issues. We did hear that government doesn't appear to be always fully understanding or willing to confront these issues, and we saw that in some of our conversations. We also heard that, from First Nations people themselves, when they detail their experiences of racism, for example, these are often poorly responded to, including defensively. So we've made a number of recommendations in this area. One thing we've recommended is that independent reviews of systemic racism are conducted across all directorates impacting overrepresentation. So that would prioritise ANC and police, for instance, but other areas could also be reviewed under that recommendation. And the sorts of things they might consider as policy, resource allocation, levels of First Nations input into decision making, and so on. To identify the issues and make recommendations for change. One thing just to emphasise, and we have in the report, is the reviews need significant levels of First Nations input So this might come via the mechanisms established through those earlier recommendations. They could help to design the review process and oversee implementation of the recommendations. But also, really importantly, the data shared by the broader community on their experiences is gathered initially and on an ongoing basis to develop and then monitor and evaluate implementation of the review recommendations. There is a whole subsection in the report on data, which we don't have time to talk about, but we have discussed in there this really important inclusion of community data to guide policy as one way to support Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, and with other actions to be included in a First Nations data strategy for Jackson CSD, and that could be developed via another First Nations-led mechanism, a First Nations data working group. And as I said, there is a section in there on funding, but because we have a lot to get through in the slide, I probably don't have time to go through that right now. What I will do is just talk about education. So that was one of those standalone areas linked to overrepresentation. Section 4 covers off on this issue, and it was seen as impacting overrepresentation via such things as disproportionate rates of exclusion, particularly for students with a disability, and lower educational expectations for First Nations students. First Nations parents we spoke to thought that both these issues pointed to systemic racism in schools, that they also talked about the school system not being set up for First Nations students, and this was seen as one reason for their reduced or lower rates of attendance and high rates of disengagement. But we also heard that schools can make and are making positive contributions that work preventatively to reduce contact with the legal system. So they contribute obviously to positive educational outcomes, but other things are important, like increasing connection and belonging and so on. Positive areas we heard about or initiatives is the Murrumbidgee School in Bimbury, and also Mullian, the Flex Ed School, which is already reducing recidivism for some students attending, where they're engaging young people who are exiting Bimbury. Just briefly, in terms of solution, again, there's a lot in the report, but just to summarise, these obviously partly sit with community, and for that reason we've recommended as a priority that government establish a First Nations-led advisory body to work with the Education Directorate, including as decision makers, so returning to those other core issues we were talking about. So this body might connect in with the justice bodies established under those earlier recommendations to kind of build coordination across issues. The group could be involved, for instance, in decisions about whether to exclude a student and how to increase access to support for students from First Nations organisations. Within the system itself, we recommended more resourcing to build on things that are working well, like Mullian. And there is a strong argument made in the report, in this part of the report and other parts, that it's much more cost effective to invest in this type of prevention than pour money into that tertiary end, something we cover off in the funding area of the report. And what we heard is that all good initiatives within education are currently working beyond capacity and need additional resourcing. And the last point is that better coordination is needed within and between directorates, so policy and procedure needs to be established on how these different directorates work together to support children and young people interacting with youth justice and child protection systems. And that's me. Over to Tatiana.
Thanks, Fiona. This section will focus on child protection, which is covered off in Chapter 5 of the report. So the first point I'd like to make is that child protection systems and out-of-home care systems have both a direct and an indirect link to overrepresentation in the criminal legal system. And this chapter of the report focuses on both elements of those more indirect linkages, but also the direct pathways that children can take into the juvenile and then subsequently the adult justice system. I think to start off with, it's important to recognise that the ACT government has introduced a range of reforms that attempt to address the overrepresentation of First Nations children in child protection and out-of-home care. And most notably, this includes the introduction of the family engagement and response teams and the legislative enshrinement of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principles. It's important to also note that despite these reforms, both in community and government consultations, we identified a number of ongoing issues that continue to impact First Nations children's families and communities, in relation to child protection specifically. And one of the key issues that we heard from community was around the lack of support for sustainable reunification pathways and the linkages that then arise, to the juvenile justice system. So what we heard from community consultations was that although that there has been greater investment in the family response engagement and response teams to support reunifications and to limit child protection intervention in families, there's not sufficient investment into early intervention and prevention pathways. And particularly there's insufficient attention being devoted to First Nations-led models of child protection and out-of-home care that place authority and self-determination in the hands of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations with strong linkages to community. Next slide, please. In the context of the direct pathway into youth justice from out-of-home care, we heard a lot about the care criminalisation process. So this is a well-established phenomenon in the literature, both in Australia and internationally, that identifies a pathway from out-of-home care, particularly residential care, straight into youth justice and then adult criminal legal systems. So it's important to understand that care criminalisation is not just about the actions of one statutory body. So it occurs across multiple statutory bodies, including child protection, out-of-home care and policing. And it tends to be based on this process whereby children's behaviour becomes subject to increased surveillance and criminalisation simply by virtue of the fact that they are in out-of-home care. So they are much more likely to come to the attention of police, and consequently, they're much more likely to be funneled into the youth justice system because they are in out-of-home care. One of the key issues that we identified in relation to this in the ACT is that there's an absence of data that speaks to the rate of criminalisation of First Nations children in out-of-home care. So we know that First Nations children are overrepresented in both child protection, out-of-home care and the youth criminal legal systems, but we actually don't have any data in the ACT that's publicly available that can give us an indication of how prevalent this care criminalisation process is. Having said that, stakeholders, again, within community and government did raise significant concerns that due to the overrepresentation of First Nations children in both systems, that there is an increased risk that they are more likely to be subjected to care criminalisation processes. Next slide. So in terms of the strategies and recommendations in relation to child protection and out-of-home care, one of the most important and one of the most immediate actions that the ACT government could take is to develop a formal protocol between ACT policing, the child protection and service providers of providing residential care that formalises a limitation on the criminalisation of children in care. So it's a formal protocol to limit children's exposure to criminalisation processes, which is endorsed by the major statutory bodies and then is rolled out across the state and implemented consistently. This requires investment. It also requires that service providers have consistent policies on how to manage children's behaviour without resorting to police intervention. The other major recommendations we make in Chapter 5 coalesce around the need for strengthening the ACCO sector to provide prevention and early intervention services, and particularly for investment in First Nations-led models of child protection that reflect self-determination principles. Next slide. So in the context of youth justice, which is covered off in Chapter 6 of the report, again, it's important to highlight some significant reforms that the ACT has introduced, particularly raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility to 14 years old and the subsequent introduction of the therapeutic support panels. We do note that these reforms aren't specific to First Nations children, but again, stakeholders in our report did note that First Nations children are presumably likely to benefit from these reforms. Having said that, and as Chris noted at the start of the webinar, the data on overrepresentation for First Nations children in the ACT is quite stark. So the most recent statistics indicate that First Nations children are 9 times more likely to be under youth justice supervision and 14 times more likely to be in youth detention than their non-Indigenous peers. And so we see over time that the trends in overrepresentation in the ACT for First Nations children are actually worsening. Next slide, please. So our community consultations identified a number of interrelated issues that feed into this overrepresentation. And the first and probably the most prominent one is the lack of appropriately funded diversion options for First Nations children. And this includes a lack of investment in prevention and early intervention strategies, programs and supports that are First Nations led and that specifically target First Nations children. What we then see is that this feeds into a very high rate of First Nations children being held on remand at Bimbri, and the overrepresentation is then compounded by children spending long periods of time at Bimbri on remand, where there's an absence of culturally appropriate services, supports and programs. We also heard from some children at Bimbri of culturally inappropriate behaviour by some staff, which feeds into issues around systemic racism that Fiona mentioned, but which also creates really unsafe environments for these children and a lack of cultural connection while they are in Bimbri. Next slide. And so again, in relation to youth justice, the main strategies and recommendations in Chapter 6 relate to the need for more funding, more recurrent and proportionate funding for community diversion programs that are culturally appropriate, that can work holistically with children, families and communities in that early intervention space. Excuse me, and that are First Nations led. We also make some recommendations around the process of diversion and decision-making around diversion by ACT policing, and the need for there to be clear and transparent processes about decisions, about when a decision is made to not utilise diversion options, which currently is not publicly available. And then finally, consistent with the recommendations we made in Chapter 5 on child protection, we also call for the development, design and implementation of youth justice models that are First Nations led. And this again would support greater cultural connection, greater cultural engagement, and would address some of the factors that contribute first to contact with the criminal legal system, but then subsequently to recidivism. Chapter 7 covers off on ACT policing. Excuse me. And so again, as with Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, it is important to acknowledge that the ACT policing have responded to the Ombudsman's own motion investigation into engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and have acknowledged the need for improved engagement strategies. At the time that community consultations were undertaken, the strategy that's subsequently been released was still under development, so communities were not aware of the strategy elements. They were released earlier this year, and we have made recommendations that the rollout and the impact of the strategy to improve engagement with First Nations communities should be continuously monitored and preferably independently evaluated to determine whether they are actually leading to measurable improvements and sustainable improvements. With that said, though, the key issue that was identified in our community and our government consultations around ACT policing was the issue of systemic racism and the way that that is seen in policing culture and the way that that then informs community perceptions of policing. What we identified, particularly with our community consultations, is that there is a pervasive mistrust of ACT policing amongst First Nations communities in the ACT, and that is fed in a large part by the actions of ACT policing as perceived by First Nations communities, which involves targeting and harassment of First Nations people, use of excessive force against First Nations people, and also a complaints mechanism that is seen as being opaque, difficult to access, difficult to navigate, and not independent. Next. So in response to what we heard from the community, we also identified that there's a lack of appropriate or sufficient cultural knowledge within ACT policing. We do note, however, that ACT policing have rolled out cultural awareness training to all 750 members, and that had been rolled out subsequent to our consultations, I believe. And again, it'll be important to keep checking to see whether this cultural awareness training has actually led to sustained improvements in community engagement by ACT policing. We also heard that there's a lack of trauma-informed practice models within ACT policing, and that this can be particularly problematic when the ACT policing are dealing with First Nations children who may be heightened at the time of police contact. And this again links back to the discussion of care criminalisation, where trauma-informed practice models become even more salient. And as noted previously, there is that absence of accessible complaints mechanisms. And while ACT policing have indicated that there are multiple avenues for accountability, including through external complaints mechanisms, what we heard from community is that these are difficult to access, and that sometimes community members can actually be actively discouraged from making complaints in the first place. And so our recommendations again centre on the need for greater police accountability that is independent and that is done in a way that is transparent for community. That community can see how police are being held accountable, particularly in instances where their actions involve excessive use of excessive force, or where people are perceived to be targeted or harassed. And that will be done through an independent oversight body linked to the mechanisms that Fiona discussed at the start of the webinar. We also have identified that ACT policing should be a priority area for a systemic racism review in the ACT. And that's it for me. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Tatiana. Okay, so first of all, with bail, I think one of the major points that we make initially is that the lack of data around bail makes it really difficult to develop policy that might remedy and improve access to bail. So it's difficult to find any data in relation to bail decisions, bail conditions, outcomes of bail breaches, or the type of breaches that are broken down by Indigenous status. In relation to the standalone provision in the Bail Act that requires consideration of factors of a person's Indigenous status when determining bail, we'd originally made that recommendation in the first report. In the second report, we've made that recommendation again, that legislative change needs to occur, but there also needs to be standalone provisions that also require consideration of factors related to disability and mental health when determining bail. In relation to the presumptions against bail, the former Law Reform and Sentencing Advisory Council, which was abolished, had been scheduled to review the presumptions for and against bail scheme. And so there's no current review underway as far as we're aware, although the ACT government has acknowledged previously the disproportionate effect of bail laws on First Nations people. So we recommended that review be undertaken, particularly in terms of the impact of bail laws on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also as to whether the bail scheme actually contributes to community safety, which was the argument for its establishment in the first place. There was widespread support for weekend bail to include Sunday from people we spoke with, and we've supported that in a recommendation. There was also major support for Nurumbai and Front Up, the two programs run by the Aboriginal Legal Service. But obviously the biggest gap in relation to that is the unavailability of that scheme for young people, and that really needs to be remedied. And finally, in relation to bail, we note that in 2024, the Standing Committee on Justice and Community Safety made a number of recommendations in terms of improving access to bail in relation to developing various support services in the community. And we support, rather than just reiterating a similar recommendation, we support that earlier recommendation from the Standing Committee's report. Okay, next one, Asha. Thanks. In terms of finalised criminal matters in the courts, Aboriginal young people make up 28% of those finalised criminal matters in ACT courts, adults 9% in the magistrates' courts, and 13% in the Supreme Court. So, obviously overrepresentation throughout the criminal court system. We looked at sentencing and we found that 4 in 10 First Nations people sentenced in criminal courts in the ACT were sentenced to a custodial sentence, compared to 2 in 10 non-Indigenous defendants. Now, we can't, on the limited basis of the data that's available, don't know the reasons behind that. It may be due to the seriousness of the offence, it may be due to prior record, it may be due to systemic discriminatory matters that lead to those more severe outcomes, but that's something that we've recommended needs to be reviewed. The development of the Warrnambool, Gallimbani and Supreme Court pilot were all strongly supported by people that we spoke to. From our understanding, the bail part of the Gallimbani court, at least at the end of the year and earlier this year, had been suspended, and that certainly needs to be reintroduced. And we also note that stakeholders raised the issues around credibility of these courts in the community and the need to enhance that credibility. And we understand that, particularly in relation to the Gallimbani court, that's been undertaken. We recommended the Supreme Court pilot circle sentencing list be made a permanent feature of the court system, and probably subject to a review before that happens, particularly in relation to a number of issues, but in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experience reports in particular, there's widespread support for those reports, but some discussion on who should actually auspice those reports. We don't take a position on that, but we certainly recommend that be part of any review that's undertaken, and that whoever has responsibility for those reports receive recurrent funding to do so. One of the other issues that we looked at, which was often raised, was that people might be pleading guilty to access the Gallimbani court. So we had to look at guilty pleas more generally. And I think, there's a much broader context to put this into, and that is quite simply that around 91, 92% of all people who receive a guilty outcome in the courts have pleaded guilty. So the vast majority of people plead guilty, and I don't necessarily know that it's such an issue that affects the Gallimbani court. Many people will plead guilty simply to get the matter over and done with. And there is very little difference between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, less than 1 percentage point in terms of those who plead guilty. There was widespread support for the recommendation that was in our first report, and then we've made it again in the second report, and that is that the legislative provisions were introduced to require sentencing courts to take into account the unique and systemic background factors in relation to First Nations people, which of course was a recommendation from the 2017 Australian Law Reform Commission report. We looked at the drug and alcohol sentencing list as well. That's been operating for 5 years. We just don't really know what sort of access or outcomes there have been for First Nations people going before the courts. In one of the earlier implementation review that was undertaken, I think, by ANU, it was found that there was a lack of participation or an unrepresentatively low representation of Aboriginal people before DASL, the drug and alcohol sentencing list. And so there really needs to be a review of how we can ensure First Nations access to the court, that issues around assessment and intake and successful completion are all benefiting First Nations people. In relation to First Nations women, one of the issues that was raised with us is access to support for First Nations women who are applying for family violence orders through the court process, support through the court process, and access to completing those orders. And I'm referring here to Indigenous specific support. And so we have made a recommendation in relation to that. I'll move on now, just in terms of time, to talk about the AMC and imprisonment rates. First Nations imprisonment, at least at the end of 2024, was the highest it had been at any time in the ACT in the last 11 years. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the level of overrepresentation of First Nations people in the ACT is the highest in the country. There's been an increase in remand prisoners, and that is being significantly driven by an increase in First Nation male remandees. And we also note the high proportion of Indigenous women who are on remand. On average, around 80% of Indigenous women were on remand during 2023, 2024. The need for an increase in community-based sentencing options, reductions in the rate of return to prison, and alternatives to custodial remands are all important. All of those are important in reducing imprisonment for First Nations men and women. The subject of human rights was prevalent in our discussion around the AMC and imprisonment, and that's particularly relevant in relation to the ACT, given the logic behind the development, the establishment of the AMC. We argue that the oversight bodies do the best they can within the context of the resources they've got, but the core problem has been the failure of government to implement multiple recommendations, which have often been repeated from one inquiry to the next. In relation to, and probably the most central around those, has been the absence of a structured day and the need for that to change. In relation to drugs, illegal or illicit drug use in the AMC, we could talk about that for an hour in itself, but I'll simply say that, look, while interdiction methods are important, that is the control of drugs coming into the prison, we also argue that there is a dramatic need to reduce demand of drugs. And this was noted before the AMC was established. One of the reasons for establishing the AMC was a structured day and, you know, the ability to lower demand for illicit drugs. We recommend the use of wastewater testing in the AMC to actually accurately gauge what the prevalence of use is in the AMC and the type of drug use. But overall, there needs to be a reduction in demand rather than simply trying to control supply. And by reducing demand is really about providing opportunities for people in the prison to engage in meaningful activities rather than the kind of boredom that we were frequently told about when we were in AMC. In terms of programs, I'll just say that First Nations men and women that we spoke to in the AMC strongly valued cultural programs. They were the programs that really people talked about wanting to do, of needing to do. And at the same time, we were disturbed to see the reduction in those programs that had been occurring, programs that had been discontinued or there was limited access to. Also in relation to the AMC, again, just quickly, we recommended the introduction of cultural support plans, that is for individuals within the prison, similar to what's been introduced in child protection and in some jurisdictions in youth justice. And it's difficult to see the AMC having any rehabilitative role at the moment in terms of the difficulty of accessing programs, problems in terms of accessing employment and so on. And there's recommendations that are made around that. Just the last point I'll make 2 points in relation to the AMC. One is that we recommended the introduction of a civil law clinic for the AMC. There had been some trials in relation to that with women, but that really needs to be looked at in terms of reducing re-imprisonment because of the inability to resolve various civil law problems, whether that's debt or whatever. And finally, in relation to the AMC, we recommended an inquiry into the deaths that occurred over the last 2 years. So this was we recommended an inquiry into both First Nations and non-Aboriginal deaths in prison. There were 7 deaths in 2 years in the AMC, and in the previous 10 years, there'd only been 6 deaths. Of those 7 deaths, 3 were Indigenous people, and they occurred within a 7-month period. I won't go in lack of time to say why we recommended a general inquiry rather than one that was only looking at Indigenous deaths in custody, but I'll leave that. It's explained in the report. And very quickly, the final part deals with parole, reintegration, post-release support. We pay particular attention to parole on the basis that, the research data suggests that people who receive parole and successfully complete parole have lower rates of recidivism and commit less serious offences than those who are unsupervised. But it seems that there are significant issues that need to be addressed in relation to parole in the ACT. We've made recommendations around that. Positive things that have been happening, certainly external report sites have been a useful addition. And as far as we're aware, the ACT is the only jurisdiction that has external report sites in Australia. Obviously, the major area is the problems in accessing housing, residential rehabilitation and AOD, and there's and assistance with employment and literacy programs, and there's recommendations in relation to that. So I'll leave that section of the report there, and just a couple of comments before we move to the questions. I think we've still got time for those, and then I think is that what we've stated in the report is that one of the most significant problems facing the review is that government agencies will continue with the siloed effect that Fiona referred to, that they'll just read the sections in the report that they think applies to them and not worry about the rest of it. And so totally ignore the actual problem that we're identifying as being key to changing things. And I think as many people have frequently observed, governments, when they're responding to these reviews, take a minimalist approach, a minimalist approach to implementation, which largely allows for business as usual. They rebadge things they're already doing and say, well, that's responding to recommendation X. And we really see these as being the two kind of major dangers that are facing the report. Thanks, James.
Okay, so we had 2 questions come through on the Q&A. I'll just give a moment for those to build, hopefully a little bit more. If anyone has anything else, please put it up. As we said, if we don't get through them specifically now in the next few minutes, we'll get back to you. But with that, I think there was a question from Noel around what steps need to be taken to implement the report's recommendations regarding education for the incarcerated. I think possibly Chris or Fiona to touch on this one. But Chris did, I suppose, allude to the idea of programs, specifically First Nations programs within them, the centre. Additionally, with the cuts that are happening across education, not just in ACT, but nationally, and I think Noel would be across that, is with those cuts, there's been a big reduction. And so in terms of extended period of programming and what those programs are, the continuation of those was something specifically that we heard from when we were inside AMC. But Fiona and Alison, I've type something up and we can email that through, but did you want to comment?
Chris, maybe that's one for you to jump into.
Sure. Yeah, look, there's a number of recommendations around education. I mean, there's I guess a number of elements to thinking about education. One is a really important one is literacy, numeracy and literacy, and the lack of that attention to that in the AMC is really, I think, important. But it's also, the cultural programs that are educative that are really, I think, important as well. And also in relation to training, the number of issues around training and employment in the AMC are, I think, quite profound most of the kind of training work is related to running the prison as to real training. So I think that they all relate broadly to education, and we have recommendations around those areas. Sorry, and in relation to implementation, I mean, we would see this, and this kind of goes back to one of the earlier questions that was there. We'd see this oversight role as being really important, both externally and also through the senior appointment that Fiona talked about at the beginning, senior appointments in JACS, police, and ACT corrections.
I'm happy to jump into that second question as well. Do you want to read that out though, James? Because that's Chris just started on it.
I'm just going to have a short response for Noel as well that I'll upload. But the second question was from Indra from Justice Reform Initiative around, do you think the 3 positions recommended would be better than having one person whose role would be to coordinate across Declarariates, a Justice Reinvestment Coordinator General who works across these?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I guess the way we approached it is that each of those areas, so each of those agencies that we've recommended placing positions in are really important areas in their own right. Certainly when we went out to community for community conversations, the AMC and policing were really significant issues that needed a lot of attention. And maybe we were trying to avoid isolating the work into a single role. It really does need those positions across those 3 different agencies. When we talked about setting up bodies, I think we mentioned that we had some discussions about setting up a social justice commissioner role, for example, and quite a few people did say, look, it's not really about setting up a single role. We need to kind of bring a bit of a collective around this, and probably that applies in government as well. However, the question is valid because we also heard that the more roles you create and the more you fragment things, sometimes things get diluted and accountability becomes more problematic. The idea would be that they'd each focus on their different areas that they're sitting in, and the actual one of the objectives of creating the 3 positions is that they would come together and try to coordinate across the 3 different agencies. And then I think these are the sorts of questions we think the roles are important to establish, but questions about how things come together, we think that is something for consideration in that recommendation 2.2 process. It needs to be a First Nations led process from people that really know the local context, can have a lot more information. When we went out to community, I guess they didn't really have a full sense of how government was currently operating, what's currently in place in government. And so what we are thinking is that all of the information gets presented during that process, including around these roles. And there's a decision made at that point about what else needs to be done to build that coordination, accountability and decision making. So that's how I'd respond to that. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that?
No.
Yeah.
Do you want me to respond to that? Oh, sorry, James.
Well, no, just quickly on that before we get to Chris, I think it does build upon the implementation or increase in terms of First Nation identified positions with the 3 rather than rolling them specifically into one. We've put together a response to that and can send it through, but it is really looking at the separate positions and the positives and negatives of that, and what people were saying in practice on the ground is what led us to that outcome. Chris? Ben's
I was just going to respond to Albert's question there. Is there any particular reason why a general inquiry into the deaths in custody and not a pointed inquiry into the First Nations deaths? I think it's not that there wouldn't be an inquiry into the First Nations deaths as well, but given that there was such a dramatic number of deaths in a short period of time of 2 years, 3 of which were First Nations people, if we're interested in understanding what systemic racism is, I think we need to know what systemic issues are actually, if there were any, were driving those deaths. So is the systemic problems in relation to the AMC affecting all people in prison? Or is there systemic racism ones that specifically affect First Nations people? And I think an inquiry needs to be able to address both of those. It may well be that the reason for some, or a major reason for those deaths relates to more general systemic issues that need to be addressed, or there may be aspects that specifically relate to systemic racism within the AMC. And I think we need to be able to kind of tease that out a bit more if we want to do something about it. So that was the reason for looking at the 7 deaths rather than the 3 First Nations people. Not to ignore them, they're part of it, a clear part of it, but to be able to kind of delineate where the problems lie.
And we'll get something further to you there, Albert. Chris, we just missed one from Ben, the CEO of ACT Courts. We are looking for a fund in the current budget cycle to implement some of the recommendations from the report around circle sentencing, but I am unsure how moving on this now would sit the consultation governance process in the report.
Yeah, well, it's partly to Fiona as well, and I think,
Yeah.
look, they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
So, yeah, there are recommendations in relation to the court, to Gallimbani court, which can be acted upon. I don't think that it needs to be dependent on a First Nations representative body, despite the
No,
importance.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, and then we had Mel. That was one of those special thanks to Mel for the assistance with the
Yes. thanks,
youth. What has been the ACT government's response to this report and the recommendations?
Well, we're still waiting on a formal response, which we understand is due this month. I guess we might be hearing that some of the more structural, substantive stuff is important, but probably some of the hardest work to do. And that's probably why it's still not done, because it is quite hard stuff to tackle. But yeah, we really need to wait for that formal response that comes out this month.
And with that, in the last few moments, we'll bring it to a close. And I have gotten those 6 questions down, and we'd like the first one, we'll get a more detailed response back to those individuals. But thank you everyone for today, and thank you to ACT government and those specific people for assisting with this one. And putting this on. We're aiming to be down again in ACT to revisit AMC and Bimbri to deliver these findings to those individuals, young people and adults who participated. So we will be in ACT and feeding that back and looking to put on another community engagement session to feed these results back as well. So again, thank you everyone so much for the time and this work and this project. We have really enjoyed it, and hard stuff, but very important findings. And thank you to our team for that work.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.